Today's guest is Liz O'Donnell, who is the founder of Working Daughter, a community for women balancing elder care and career. And we talk a lot about childcare. We talk a lot about working mothers. Or we also talk about stay-at-home moms and women leaving the workforce due to COVID and the pandemic. There's a lot of conversation around caretaking in those circles in those ways, but oftentimes we're not talking about elder care, which is a huge swath of our population that is not necessarily being given the time and the space to be supported in the same way that we do when we talk about childcare. So Liz talks about the fact that she actually initially was writing a book about childcare and navigating kind of motherhood and career. She talks about how that book, published right around the time she stepped into the shoes of working daughterdom in her life. And so in this episode, we really dive into the dynamics of how childcare and elder care are similar and how they're different. We talk about the possibilities where in your workplace, in the political sphere, in your individual relationships, and as a collective, we can actually create a future where we support those of us who are stepping into the shoes of that working daughter profile. So here's the thing that's so important too. There isn't one way to do it right. I think if you've listened to this podcast before, you know that. Liz and I talk a lot about the importance of being able to hold many truths at the same time, to hold many emotions at the same time. And especially when we're talking about grief a little later on in the episode, which I think is so important. So for any of you that have been grappling with or navigating grief, it is so important for us to just have a little bit of extra self-compassion as we're trying to navigate what is, unfortunately, a new normal in the last couple of years of so much grief and so much trauma and so much loss. But also the fact that as we are shifting into an older baby boomer generation and systems and structures aren't set up to support us in the caretaking that we actually need as a population, how we can navigate our feelings and our experiences as we step into new shoes, as we evolve into new versions of ourselves and how we have to show up as in caretaking duties. So Liz provides so many great resources. We had a conversation about a week before this podcast episode was recorded, and we talked about so many great things, and I'm so excited that you got to have so many of them come back in here. And I'm just so excited that you get a chance to meet Liz. This is definitely an episode to be bookmarking and to be sharing with anybody in your life who is navigating elder care and their career. So without further ado, here's my friend Liz. Welcome, Checkbox Other, everyone. I'm so excited to introduce you to Liz O'Donnell. Liz, welcome to Checkbox Other. I'm so excited for you to be here.
I am too. I had the benefit of speaking to you the other day on a different, similar topics, but different format. And I wish we didn't even have to wait 3 days. So I'm so excited to keep talking to you.
Yeah, I feel the same thing. I felt like we were like, oh God, the time went by so fast. We have so much more to talk about. And so it was wonderful to be like, we're going to talk later. Don't worry about it. So for all of you who weren't on that conversation with us or weren't part of the Working Daughter community, I am so excited for you to get to know Liz. And so Liz, the first thing I do is I hand over the mic for you to give us a Cliff Notes version of your journey, the twists, the turns, the aha moments that led you to where you are today and kind of the stuff we're going to be talking about.
Well, I was living the typical life of a white middle-class working mother who thought her life was so busy. And I just written my first book, which was ironically about, it was called, well, it's still called Mogul Mom and Maid, the Balancing Act of the Modern Woman. And it's about the chore wars and the fact that women do more housework and childcare than men, regardless of, who works and who doesn't and what their jobs are, et cetera, et cetera. And so I was trying to promote that book, and my parents were in their 80s and just started needing more and more care. So that was really cramping my style because it was taking up more and more time. And then one day, July 1st, 2014, they were both diagnosed with terminal illnesses on that day, about an hour apart.
Oh my goodness.
So then my mind completely shifted, much to my publisher's chagrin. I was like, I have a new idea. They were like, oh my God, we need to get our money on your first book, please. But I started to realize that there were lots of people solving for working motherhood, and as there should be. But no one was talking about what I deemed working daughters, so women who are balancing elder care and career. As I like to say it sometimes, we spend a lot of time thinking about workers who are parents, but not much time thinking about workers with parents. So when that happened and I went through it, I actually kept a diary through the whole experience and turned that into my next book, Working Daughter. And the universe just wanted me to be a caregiver. And so that's what I talk about and do now 24/7.
It's like, it's one of those things that for those of you that didn't know about Working Daughter, have not had any conversations around elder care, and you're hearing this story, I'm hoping you have your own aha of, oh yeah, why don't we talk about that? Oh yeah, that's a very real thing. Because it's not like this is something that is so foreign. It's something that happens each and every day for so many people, and we don't talk about it. It's, either whispered about or just glazed over altogether. And so I'm just like, I'm grateful that like you said to your publishers, by the way, we got to go over here. This is the unserved market. We need to tap into this, because there are so many people, obviously, through the community we've created that like need a space for this to be acknowledged, and then hopefully a space to heal and a space to create actual policy and systems that can support the reality that there's so many people in the space. So before we hop into that, I would love to hear what I always feel like when we do the bios, there are like these moments of other that pop up anyway, but I like to give people the kind of forum to say, all right, is there a time in your life where you felt other or different that you feel has really structured or informed the way that you operate today?
Yeah, I think being an elder care giver in the workplace has made me feel so othered. I think my elder care experience went on about 6 years of sort of, real hands-on elder care. I don't know if this came up when you and I spoke, but I was also a spousal caregiver. My husband had pancreatic cancer, so now I'm a widow too. So all of those experiences, I think there's a movement in the workplace, and maybe it's always been there, but it just feels more intense lately, that our coworkers are our families, and culture is so important. Well, define culture, because for me, culture is a place where I can do really good work, know that I'm adding value, and then get the hell out because I have family obligations. I don't want to go bowling with you, no offense.
Yeah.
And so the experiences that I've been having in my life for the past since 2013, really aren't that pleasant to talk about and make people really uncomfortable. And so when we're in these workplace cultures now, where it's like, everybody share, everybody tell a happy memory. And my mind immediately goes to things that I know that really, even though my mission is to normalize these things and make people feel less othered, I know that I'm going to like shut down the room, so that all of these life experiences that I've had can really make me feel othered. When somebody says like share something happy, my mind starts to whirl. I'm like, oh, no. Oh, okay, I'm going to be really inauthentic as we're talking about authenticity. So
yeah.
Does that make sense?
Oh my gosh, does that make sense? Of course. Yeah, I think it is. It's so interesting because we are taught that it's a binary experience, that like, tell me something happy doesn't mean that there are a whole bunch of other emotions that get to exist there. It's either happy or sad or happy or mad or happy or, whatever the opposite of happy feels like for you. Right. And so it's really interesting that we don't make space for the wholeness of people. And so in a workplace, that in order to operate as the appropriate employee, you have to be gung-ho about bowling, but you can't talk about the realities of what are actually impacting your ability to show up in the workplace one way or another. You're like, is not the fact that I can't bowl a 300, that's not important, but let's create space so I can get the work done with you as that element of whatever we're calling a family in the workplace is. And so then I can do the other parts of my life so I can show up as fully as I'm able here, because it might not be that I can be sharing with you like the full story all the time. And also, I think there is this whole, when you're talking about that fabric of family, the business is a family, it's like, but there's a whole lot of really dysfunctional family dynamics that we're all trying to bring together that we don't have any idea where anybody else really came from. And so family means different things to different people. And if we don't actually create space to talk about what this particular family is, we just start creating those patterns and perpetuating those patterns and meaning making out of things like you saying, hey, I can't come bowling, to somebody, they might not have any clue, and they make a story about you with that. And you're like, I don't even have time to coach you through why this is happening because I need to go do that. And so,
Right.
I think it is so important. And so I can only imagine there are so many people listening, like nodding their heads, being like, oh, I know exactly how that feels, because we are like, oh, let's kumbaya, come together, but also keep it positive, keep it safe.
And super quick anecdote. I remember I had just come back to work after my dad's funeral, and I was sitting around in the conference room, after an internal meeting. It was one of those conference rooms, everything's a beanbag. So we're all just like sitting around cash. And one of my coworkers was planning her wedding, and I was older than, I've always lately have worked in these companies where there's like a few people over 45 and then a bunch of people like under 35, and there was nothing in the tenure. I don't know what that's about, but so I was the only one like over 40 in the room, and everyone else was 35 and under. This one was planning her wedding, and she's like trying to figure out the formula for how much alcohol per guest. And just because I had just been through it, I was like, well, when I plan my dad's funeral, this is my rule of thumb. And all these people under 30 who haven't thought about their dad's funeral were just like, she said death, she said funeral. Like it was just, I just killed the mood. And that, I mean, and then I was like, okay, so yeah, I am othered in the sense that, and it's not as othered as some others, otherness can be, if those are even words, but these are moments that make you feel like you can't bring your full self to work at a time when we're talking about bring your full self to work.
Yeah, for sure. And, the important thing I think is, I remember going to, I'll call it the mass conference for women, because that's where I feel like those huge ones were like, 10,000 people and people were talking.
Yeah.
And I remember it was about like, I forget her name. Oh my goodness. She was a disability rights advocate. And she was talking about the fact that in our culture, we tend to try to create like the oppression Olympics. And so like your story isn't worth hearing if it's not the worst ever. And
Right.
if you're sharing it, you need to be like, well, it could be worse. And, what's so important is that every person has an experience of this, and it is impactful in their lives. And the more we're able to create space for them, the more it's welcome for whoever on whatever scale, because it's not really a linear one. We're not trying to get the gold medal here. It is so important. And I think, can you talk a little bit about how creating spaces for those moments that have shut down rooms where people are like, we were just talking about a wedding. We can't do that. We can't hold two things at once. Creating a space like Working Daughter has opened up an arena for people to actually be able to have these conversations that have historically been shut down before they even got to start.
Well, it's exactly what you said. I mean, as the Working Daughter community has grown, and it started in 2015, so it's really grown over the past 7 years. We have these sort of norms and tenets that kind of bubble to the top without ever having, set them forward. And one of them is that idea that we can hold two truths at the same time. I mean, that is such a reality of elder care. And part of the reason I started Working Daughter was when I was caring for my parents, and I'd, have insomnia at 3 a.m, like, I don't know how to help them. And I'd go online and Google like how to, get your dad to stop driving, whatever. And back then, so many of the caregiving websites were what I call like butterflies and unicorns. And it was just like, well, just sit down and tell your dad how you feel about him driving, and he'll hand over the keys, and you'll all hug, and you'll have tea, and everything will be great. With the day that I talked to my dad about not driving, I was dropping F-bombs within like 5 minutes of the conversation. And I didn't normally swear at my dad, but it was just, with the two of us were just like, it just devolved so quickly. So I was looking for a place that was real talk, that was useful, but also as I would go out promoting my first book and people would say, what are you working on? And I would next, and I'd say nothing right now, I'm caring for my parents. I'd get the butterfly unicorn, like the tilted head and the happy nod and the what a blessing to care for those who cared for you, which is true. But in those moments when I was trying to promote my book and see my kids and hold down my job, I was like, this is not a blessing, this is a burden. And I soon found out that you couldn't say burden in caregiving circles. It was like, she said the B word. So, but my reality was both things were true. I could recognize that it was amazing to show up for my parents, and be there for them. But lots of times the reality was I was tired, I was overburdened, I was overtaxed, and it was a nightmare. So, so Working Daughter was partially created just for that reason, that we could speak the truth that I say that you can't necessarily talk about in polite company, and know that even though I might go on to the Facebook community, for example, and want, this is event. My mother was shuffling on her walker in the grocery store, and I couldn't take it one more minute. Or you hear a lot about like, if I have to watch one more episode of Law and Order on, volume 75, right? And I love them, and I want this to be over, and I will be sad when it's over. And we're capable of holding so many opposing thoughts that are true at the same time. And for me, it wasn't until I experienced caregiving and started thinking about caregiving, writing about caregiving, that I realized our capacity for that. I don't know that people who haven't experienced some kind of extraordinary stress don't know that yet. They'll find out. Yeah.
Well, yeah, the level of resilience, and then also the evolution, right? So like what you're coming to the table with, and your ability to just collaboratively think with all the experiences you have, but also how you're able to evolve in a situation that's a completely new normal every day. There is an element of, when we talked, I was talking about the experience of kind of being that sandwich generation of, being somebody that has been a caregiver to younger children and watching them form their brains, right? And form their experiences in the world through growing up in the way that you did. You have that lived experience of maybe they're growing up differently than you, but you're like, okay, I kind of get this. But when it's elder care, it's redefining relationships that have been there since the jump for you most of the time from very early on. And so it's not just, here's what I can take from what I knew, but how can I watch my brain and my level of resilience adapt to the situation I have now so I can survive this. And so I can make room for the fact that, like, I love this person. This person was so formative in my life. And also this person is different. Our relationship is different, and it's making it so we have to show up differently. And also, can I hold both those past memories and those past experiences where I want them to be without, minimizing or glorifying them? Can they exist in the same space, in the same story here? So okay. There is, again, caretaking in itself. Everybody knows what the word means, but when we talk about, I think, I didn't know, I didn't do as much research today. I'm realizing, Nikki, come on. But I didn't realize that when you were talking about your mom mogul and maid dynamic, that there was that very kind of heavy lean on caretaking and the imbalance in a heteronormative situation of women kind of holding that space. What did you feel came from the learnings of that book and that, really deep dive in research as you were forming the space in the eldercare space?
That's a really good question. I mean, a lot of the same themes, and realizing that we don't carry those themes sort of all the way through the family experience, right? I think at one point I had the working title of the book was something like From the Breakfast Table to the Board Table or something like that, because the concept that, and at the time the book came out, so, or that I started working on the book. So like say 2011, 2012, there was a lot of this white corporate feminism conversation going on, and all about how women need sponsors and what's the other word? Sponsors and
mentors, sponsors,
mentors. Thank you, at work, and more training, more assertiveness training, and all of those things are true. Yeah. And the thing that I was hung up on was that, but so much of our career challenges don't happen in the workplace. So yes, sponsors are nice. But if I'm doing the dishes and the laundry till midnight every night, or I feel like I have to go to PTO, so I can't go on the trip, or whatever it might be, then all the sponsors and assertiveness training and imposters training and all that won't even, make a dent. And, had no idea that it was so far beyond laundry and dishes. And, at the time I was hung up on getting kids cleats and, and right. The dance recitals, would be on the calendar for months, and you would find out on Tuesday that you needed tangerine colored tights and a chartreuse tutu. And by the way, bring those in on Thursday, and I'm on a train in New York, So the conversation was only about small children and housework, and, didn't even, and then all of a sudden for me, what started to impact it was small tasks again, but with a whole different demographic. So I'm not sure that I'm really answering your question, but it makes me kind of shudder and wonder, what other blind spots do we all have? And how do we ever learn to go through these things, or to not have to go through these things, to empathize, to solve for, because it's once you go through it. I joke sometimes about some of the younger women I worked with. I'm like, oh, they've discovered motherhood. Here we go,
Yes. 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 It's funny because I think what you're tapping into, especially in the beginning part, was this idea of, in order for me to be successful in this space, I have to act like the elements of my life that are not accounted for in the system don't exist, or they happen, while you're sleeping, I'll do that because I still need to be fully present. The only way that I can be successful in the workplace is to do it like everybody else is doing it who isn't that caretaker. And hopefully the space that we're in now, where I think a lot of people are in this, okay, there's something new every day and I'm never going to get it right. There is this frustration of, when are we going to go back to here's the way you operate? What is the operating manual to be successful as a leader? Like, okay, where I understand it's moved and changed, but where's the new edition? And really what it is not that we're going to give you a 10-step guidebook on how to be a good leader and every person will follow that. And then they will all become the next version of whatever robotic leader we've got. It's the idea that we can make space for there to be multiple different types of leaders, and whether that be CEO leader or just leading in your life, that then you can operate together. That in order to be successful, you don't have to be like everybody else, but you have this ability to understand that it's not a threat for you to be different than who I am. And so it is so interesting, I think, when you're talking about this, oh, this is one experience that I had. And then elder care opened up a whole nother lane that I never saw. What other lanes are there? Is kind of this idea of, okay, can we just allow ourselves to keep broadening without it being like, I need to be the best at all of these things. But all of these things, again, can exist at the same time, whether I'm holding them or not, that there might be other people living an experience that I'm not familiar with, and that's okay. And so I think there's so much of the tenets of what you were talking about with the working daughter community of like, we're creating a space to normalize the fact that like, you can feel like you just like want to like burn the bridge over here and cuddle over here and just be in the fetal position over here. And all of that is a normal human experience. One of them isn't being a good daughter and the other being a bad. It's not kind of how that works. And so it's really, I think, interesting because we're so categorized in the way we operate, that we like to, or at least we've been trained to bucket things in very specific boxes and say, okay, I know how to handle this thing when it comes up. And so when this new thing comes up, I have no idea how to do that because nobody taught me. And it's like, you can pull a bunch of things from that other box. They actually work here. And so it's beautiful, I think, as you're talking about your experience, how that came to be.
Yeah. And I think one of the good things about elder care, spousal care, non-child care, and you mentioned a few minutes ago, you used the word heteronormative, talking about Mogul Mom and Maid, and it actually was a very heteronormative book. What was my point in that? Oh, but my point is, so elder care versus child care, assuming like a pretty typical developing child, right, is so much less messy than elder care is really messy. Cancer care is really messy. Dementia care is really messy. Child care can be messy. I mean, literally and figurative, right? I mean, and there are bad days and all those memes about moms pulling their hair out and all that, all true. But again, assuming like a pretty normal developing child, it's also fairly predictable. Like, what age the child is going to go to school, and what those hours are going to be, and when those hours extend, and when vacations are, and when to schedule well checks. And there's a whole, elder care is so messy because there's no predictability. You never know when it starts. When you're dealing with illness, there's good days, good hours, bad hours. There's so many layers, it's loss versus life, blah, 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 that I think it is such a really good model for the more people go through it. I think the more it is going to just have an effect, a positive effect for all of the challenges that people bring to work and life, because you have to sort out so many things at the same time and be ready to pivot and swirl and respond and react.
I love too, one of the things as you were talking is that it's not that these things haven't been happening for a long time. It's that we're more connected, like, because elder care, like people living with their family, multiple generations of family and taking care of one another, like it's been part of the human experience for so long. But the systems we operate in, like, again, there's for sure a different statistical dynamic, I'm sure, but the systems we operate in don't acknowledge them, but we still have so much more connection with each other and have the ability to communicate what's happening. And childcare has this like that kind of glow that we were talking about weddings, even though it might be a diaper that just blew out all over you. That's not glorious and glamorous. There is this, you're bringing a life into this world. This is their purpose in life, right. And then there's this part that's very real. That's okay. And also, I need to hold space to care for this other person that is not necessarily seen as, oh my goodness, look at the beauty of how life is progressing. Even though this is a part of the beauty of the life experience, it might not feel beautiful all the time. And so how we actually create systems, because though we have all of these, we still have paid family leave debates. We have, which again is most of the time, let me also say that's most of the time talking about childcare, which doesn't necessarily have to be childcare. We think about
Right.
family leave.
Right.
But we have a lot of systems in place to support that part of our societal growth. And we don't necessarily have that level of support from a systemic perspective in elder care, in spousal care. So when you're thinking about this and talking about this with so many women that are going through this, how do you think about, if we were to have the forum and the space, like we walk up to the Senate and had this ability to really talk about, like, here are the things that we need to actually have a system in place to support this very, very real need. What would those types of things be? What kind of topics would come up? What are the kind of the loudest versions of these things, or the most, what you think are the most pivotal fulcrum points?
Well, I think it's really helpful to compare childcare and elder care just to open people's eyes to the differences and the fact that we're not just taking what we're solving for or experiencing here and, bringing it to another part of life because it's so different. I think we can, in this country, we can put our kids in public schools and know that they're going to be watched, cared for, in many cases fed for X hours a day. That's huge. I mean, assuming, you're in a decent or semi-decent public school system, that is huge. That does not exist at all anywhere for elder care. And so people get to their elder care phase and they're shocked, like, wait, I have to pay for this? Like there's so little knowledge that assisted living, memory care, memory care can run up to $10,000 a month, assisted living, 7,500 and up. You've got, I don't know this number on dementia, but it's a huge percentage of elderly people are coming down with dementia. So you're talking about $10,000 a month out of pocket, private pay. Like, I think because we have the systems that we have in place, and they're not perfect by any means. We still have plenty of work to do. We still have the highest maternal rate, right, of on top of so many countries, but we do have systems in place. Like we have public school systems. Our kids go from the age of for whatever, up to 17 or 18. And like I said, are fed and cared for and not on the streets and not left alone at home. And we can go work in those hours. So you get to elder care, and I think you just kind of assume that those systems are in place again. So I think it's the storytelling and the comparing of like the processes we have in place, certainly not perfect for childcare, do not exist, people, for elder care. They do not exist. The other thing that doesn't exist is when you have a baby, and you're in the hospital, you spend a couple of days, oftentimes in these maternity places, there's like, a diapering class, a bathing class, nurses who help you learn how to feed. There's so much information, literature. There are spaces with the words mom in them, mom blogs, mom conferences, mom books, etc., what to expect, where there's training. There's no training on elder care. When I cared for my husband, I did wound care. I gave him an injection in his arm every day. I gave him a blood thinner in his stomach after he had a stroke. I mean, I was doing medical care, and I did not go to medical school. I'm not a nurse. I'm a writer. If I had hired a home health aide, they couldn't do those tasks because they're not licensed for them. But you're sending people home, and family is the primary caregiver. So I think it's really important that people can tell their story. If we walked up to the podium, I'm picturing it's in DC.
Yeah.
And
I am too.
Yeah. And we told them about the medical tasks that we do, the complete lack of training, and those to me are like the most striking. There's also the financial tests that we figure out and the legal tests that we figure out. And the lack of places and spaces. So it is happening in people's homes because you can't afford anywhere else. I do a lot of work educating people around financial caregiving and working with financial planners to think about this. And I always say to them, you're dealing with elderly people who are looking at their estates and their wills and, what their long-term care plan is. And then you're looking at young families who are thinking about paying for college and mortgages and starting their 401ks. Why don't you pull it through? Because for so many people, all of these things culminate at the same time too, right? Like I'm paying mortgages, looking at tuition, and my retirement is no longer an abstract concept. It's a really soon or not soon enough, depending on how you look at it perspective. And these things all happen at the same time. And I've had my caregiving and taken those financial hits, and they all come together. So looking at the financial piece too, and showing people how those things all create this perfect storm. But where we really need to start, if we're at this forum, sorry, I'm building the agenda.
That's
Where
okay.
we
I like
really
that.
need to start, I think, is with domestic workers, right? And the people that we rely on to care for our families when we can afford care, have, no workplace benefits, lousy pay, are often immigrants. There's a shortage of them for a whole host of reasons. So, let's start where the system's really broken and then build up from there.
Yeah.
That's all.
Yeah, that's just sprinkle a little bit on top. Yeah. The other part of this that is like, so I love talking about generational change. It's one of my favorite things, because I think it is so important, and it is something where everybody feels like they belong in some place, and they've been told something about whatever the stereotypes of their generation mean. And when we're talking about the largest demographic generation, or the largest generation that we had that was like incredibly impactful for America itself, it's the baby boomer generation, right? And the baby boomer generation is getting older and older, and is in this space where we have way more people needing systems and support than we have been. Prior to that generation, we didn't have enough. And now we have a huge influx of human beings, and we're living longer than we ever have before. And so the fact that just in sheer numbers, our systems aren't supporting that. But now it's like, you can't not be touched one way or another by some version of this. And so it's not this, I always think about how we talk about mental health, and in our society, there was a lot of times where it was just like, okay, you kind of ship them off somewhere, like they go to, they went away for a while type thing.
Right.
And that, I feel like with elder care, it kind of is this, there's a lot of kind of shame dynamic in our history of talking about and creating space around this. And when it is so prevalent, it is so important, and it is so much impacting our everyday, and there's not a space to put it outside, put the care in other people's hands because they're not being supported. It is something that needs to be brought to the forefront, needs to be talked about, because each and every one of us think we're alone in the experience. And so I think when you're talking about all the different dynamics of our society that are being impacted, that it's not just that one person at home being like, okay, well, I have to go because my parent I don't know, I need to stand there and make sure that they're safe in their home or at my home, because they might be living with me. I can't be in the workplace right now. For you to look at me like, oh, there she goes again. It's like, no, there are so many me's out there right now, but we haven't been able to band together and advocate for the fact that there is a huge swath of us navigating this in silence. And so again, I think social media spaces and communities that are being built that you might not know this person, if not for the ability to connect through technology, are creating such an opportunity for different archetypes of how we show up in these times, in these spaces.
Exactly. And I made a face when you were speaking a few minutes ago, and I know nobody can hear my face that I made, but when you were saying, and it's not like this is new. And the reason I made that sort of, well, it is kind of new in a way, are all of those, points that you just called out. So we've got the baby boomers, 10,000 of them are turning 65 every single day. So rapidly aging society. So yes, we have the largest generation that, is looking and needing elder care at this point. So that's different than, what was it, the greatest generation or silent generation before them. So we definitely have more, but we also have people, as you also said, living longer. So when you live longer, you're probably also living with chronic illness. And so, I didn't grow up seeing elder care.
Right.
My parents, were great to their parents, but all four of my grandparents dropped dead almost instantaneously of some heart-related disease. Like there was no living with illness and needing care. My grandmother, was coming back from Dollar Day at Fine's Basement. Her favorite thing to do, I think it was every Tuesday or Monday at Downtown Crossing in Boston on the Red Line on the MBTA, with bags of packages, and had like an aneurysm or something. And, so she was thriving, doing what she did every day. And then she was no longer alive. There was no caring for Nana. So we haven't necessarily all grown up witnessing it and therefore expecting it. We also haven't figured out how to put a structure in place for people who are going to live to 100 years old. Dr. Joe Coughlin is at the MIT Media Lab, and
Yeah.
he's just great. He does a lot of thinking and working in this space. And he wrote a book called The Longevity Economy. And it
Oh,
was in reading his book that I was like, and he made that statement, like, we are trying right now in real time to put together structures for people who are living to 100. We've never had to do that before. And we're doing it in real time with small, I'm Gen X, we're tiny, and we were taking care of our parent, so we're doing it in real time. So a lot of this is new and
yeah.
like on the fly.
Yeah. And the part of it it keeps, when you were talking about this, I think of, so my grandparents, went to, my growing up, they went and they did part-time in Florida. So they lived in like the 55 and older community. And then when my grandfather was diagnosed with dementia, Alzheimer's, they came back up here, but are in a space that's still kind of a community of peers. And then they had the memory care dynamic, which you were talking about, that kind of helped with that progress. But again, it's cost prohibitive for sure. It is not just about the financial exchange of it all, the emotional elements, the actual support of day to day. How do you make things happen? How are you feeding yourself? How are you caring for yourself? And that my grandmother ended up becoming my grandfather's main caregiver, but she's turning 90 this month. Like, those are the types of things where it's like, we're dropping the ball in a whole bunch of ways because we're trying to build the plane as we're trying to take off. And so how do we create a space for that reality to exist and for us to make it better? And the other part that just keeps popping up is, how do we make space for the fact that these things are not going away? And we have this expectation that it's supposed to get better, that, we have this culture that we have been paying into, that when we get older, we're covered. And those systems are not paying, they're crumbling daily. So how do we reconcile our kind of our mentality, our kind of, I think of it as like the American capitalism, like, this is how it works. We pay into this, so it takes care of us later. And really what's happening is we're paying into it. It's not covering what we need. And then when we're finally in that spot, we're like, holy crap. So all the money I've been saving for something else, I need to put here, because we didn't even talk about that as a reality. And we have, like, I think of the community that my grandparents were in, like, and you're talking about the monthly costs. There's a whole economy that is like, yes, there's money here, that is really making it a transactional thing, when this is like, I think like all of the elements you just talked about, that like we could bucket, right? The financial dynamic, the kind of health dynamic of being, all of a sudden you now need to be a medical expert, to being a lawyer, to being a advocate. You have to be an advocate for, I think of like policy and politics and how things are happening. And one of the conversations I had with my mother recently was that there were shifts and changes that happened in New York State, where they were taking away benefits that the older generation had and not telling anybody. But these aren't folks that are on the internet all the time. They're not people that are, have their RSS feeds set up to give me alerts when these things happen. But it's like, oh, well, you got to now drop an additional $500 a month. How all of these systems that work in the tech savvy space are impacting folks that, the systems that they were working within, they're not necessarily versed in, and also not supported by anymore. And then we have, but keep paying into it, even though you see that it's not going to exist later. So how we create a space where it's like, what's there, where you have to pay all this money into, and we don't actually know if it's going to hold. So I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts about, especially, I'm so excited about that book, by the way, how you think about kind of that evolution and what you're seeing in I think there's like the policy and the big picture, but you're seeing in the day-to-day conversation about how people are making it through this.
Yeah. And I think two things. One is, I think family norms are changing or have to change. So like that's happening in real time too. So what I mean, for example, you see oftentimes in the working daughter community, someone will say, I just realized how much this costs. I can't believe, the government doesn't pay for this. Daddy worked so hard, and now I'm supposed to take all of his money and spend it on, a decent facility. And then someone else might chime in and say, well, what else are you going to use it for? So my parents' generation grew up, and I think up until recently, every generation above us grew up hoping to give our children a better life. Now I think we know, we might not, or we have no idea what the hell is going to happen.
Right.
and it was all about like what I'm going to leave to the children and the grandchildren. I think it's time to have different conversations about what I'm going to leave to the children and the grandchildren is not to saddle them financially and to, our money can, and I'm of course talking about, average to lower wealth and not great generational wealth. I mean, there's, family businesses and great wealth involved, and that's a whole different story. But, the average family, the plan may not be what I'm going to leave to a next generation. It's not leaving the negative to the next generation. And it's not about, well, you can't take it with you, because there won't be anything to take with us, because long-term living costs money. And so I think families and financial planners need to start having different conversations and shift the norm about, how long our money lasts and what we're going to do with it and what it means to create wealth and, to live a good long life. And the other thing I would say is we also need to take a breath. I mean, I'm all about like what needs to change. And, I'm like, I in my head, I can picture this forum and there are mics everywhere, and, the Washington, D.C. forum that you and I are imagining. And like I said, this is still kind of new. Like, so I was born in 67. So in the 70s, there were these women, right, who went to work with the big bow ties and dressed like men, and, were in the Virginia Slims commercials, and, brought home the bacon and fried it up in a pan. There were trailblazers in the 70s of working mothers who, really, beat a path forward for those of us today who are still figuring it out, but had these trailblazers. I think my generation and the people in Working Daughter now are kind of where those women were. I mean, I don't, don't say that to say, look at me, I'm like one of those 70s icons. I'm saying those women muddied through it and made it easier for the next generation. I kind of feel like those of us who are in the sandwich right now or in elder care right now, who are muddying through it and living it raw and real time, are hopefully paving a better path for those who are coming up. Because like I said, I didn't witness it because people didn't live as long, or the family structure was different and both, partners weren't at work. So, we're still operating from a care model that somebody's at home, right? I mean, doctor's appointments are in the middle of the day, and, all, meeting with any, social workers, all the people we need to meet with, it's still the middle of the day. It's much like the the education model hasn't changed. Parent teacher conferences are still from like 12:03 to 12:10, so when the heck are you supposed to go to work? So I think part of it too is we need to chill out and know that we're probably about 15 years behind the working parenthood piece, and we're appropriately where we need to be, and that's why it feels so hard.
Yeah, and from what I'm hearing, it's like showing up and doing it is actually, you don't have to have it all figured out. That's not the goal right now. It's actually doing the best you can in the moments, and honoring. I feel like, because you were talking about all of the learned knowledge that you're bringing, the experience sharing, and like continuing to allow this to be, okay, test this out. I tried this, it worked for me, maybe it'll work for you. There is no perfectionism here, even though we do operate in a society that really wants us to be going for that gold star. That's not where we are. I love too, as you were talking about kind of legacy building, that it's really a shift in how we understand that I'm going to leave more for my children than what I had, or that for my grandchildren than what I had. And again, I think, I don't know if this is what you were kind of giving a nod to, but I think climate change in itself has given us a point of like, wait a second, maybe things aren't going to be the way that they were. Like maybe just like baseline, like survival type dynamics, we don't have that sense of normalcy all the way through to be then making plans for. And how do we create a space where we can support one another in the now and hopefully in the tomorrow, but maybe not, we don't know what the next 25 years will look like. I think that's so powerful.
I mean, well, right now we don't know what tomorrow looks like, right? I mean,
yeah, it's okay, everyone. We don't know what it's going to be, but we'll be able to figure something out of it. Yeah, we're kind of in survival mode a lot of times. And so one of the things that I think is so important as we're talking about this, and it's funny because a lot of the conversations that I have on the podcast we talk about grief. Because in so many elements of our lives, we learn so much from these. I think you were talking about, if you haven't really gone through some sort of, significant grief or trauma in your life, there's a lot of things that you learn on the other side of that. And for sure, as we're talking about elder care, both in the reality of loss of life, but also when you're talking, I was not there when you were talking to your father about driving, but there is this element of the kind of loss of identity when you're having those conversations. And so there's kind of the existential grief that's happening, while at the same time, there, when somebody is ill or, you know, has cancer or wherever we're going in this, there is a finite part to how we live in our lives. And so when you're thinking about grief, and I know we talked about this when we talked last week about the fact that like we actually have compounded elements through this process of caring for people, especially when we're talking about neurological dynamics for sure, but even, you know, when our bodies are deteriorating, how we acknowledge that. So when you're thinking about holding a space where grief is like kind of the pal to elder care, how does that kind of show up? And then the other piece that I'll add to this quickly, and I'll give you the floor, is the fact that, you know, in the last few months, there has been this kind of, we'll just call it classification of prolonged grief disorder in the DSM, which is the kind of the diagnostic book for psychologists and psychiatric professionals, to say, okay, this is the amount of time that we deem as appropriate or normal to be grieving. And they came out with, after a year, if you're grieving after a year to a point where you can't function fully, whatever that might mean, then you are now seen as a disordered dynamic of grief. And so a lot of times in the podcast, we talk about like the fact that we don't actually create enough time and space for grief, but how does that work when you're kind of going through all these different layers of that through the process? I'd love to hear your take on that.
Yeah. And, you know, your producer has mentioned that we might talk about the prolonged grief disorder and the DSM. And so I was doing a ton of reading on it, and I honestly have no idea. I really think I don't understand grief at all. And I've been grieving for several years now. But let me start with what I can talk about. What I can talk about is that I know that the workplace is not prepared to deal with grief. And I mean, talk about feeling othered. Like, no, you come back after your 3 days or 10 days or whatever bereavement leave, and you better be smiling, baby. And again, nobody tells you that. You just kind of, you know how to adapt to the cultural norms, right, in the workplace. But what I don't think people realized, and maybe they realize a little bit more now, as so many people suffered so much loss during COVID, is that with caregiving, there's grief all along the way. And, people tend to talk about after death grief, like we get that, like someone dies, people are sad, grief. Okay. And then we started to learn about, and when I say we in the working daughter community, people started talking about, have you heard of this anticipatory grief? And it's, like, oh my God, I know she's going to die and I'm so sad about it. But actually grief is like, a million little paper cuts. So I was talking about, when you want to vent, and this was my vent, actually, my mother was shuffling on her walker in the grocery store and taking forever. And I was cranky about it. And now I know that rage and anger and grief can all, show up in the same way. And so my crankiness it wasn't that I was, mad at my mother for walking. So I was sad that my mother didn't have the same pep in her step, like literally, right? I was watching my mother not be the same mother that I had every day as she grieved. Meanwhile, my mother's grieving beside me, realizing that she can't do the same things, and I think of moments with my dad and moments with my husband where I had to like step in and do physical tasks, and I was, expecting them to be almost appreciative, like my dad was, got a phone call from my mother one day that my dad was up on the ladder in his late 80s cleaning the gutters. And I write about this in my book. I actually went down and stayed at my parents' house, set the alarm for 5, snuck outside and hid the ladder, and then blamed the handyman across the street and let him ride with with the shame. But because I didn't know how to stop my dad from, cleaning the gutters. So I staged a stealing of the ladder. But my whole point about that is like, I didn't appreciate that my dad was grieving, that he was no longer the capable father and guy who could climb up, and I was just like, you're being an idiot. If you fall and get hurt, you screw everything up. With my husband, it was, he's in the middle of chemo and he was weak and sick and there was a big storm and he went outside to snow blow. And I'm like, I've got this. And I couldn't understand why he was so mad at me that I was going to snow. I'm like, trying to be, because he knew that he might never be able to, help his family at snowblowing. So anyway, so they're going through their grief. You're grieving as you watch this. So grief is like, it's ongoing, especially around elder care, all the time, whether we know it or not. And so people are showing up to work with loss after loss in a work environment where we can't handle grief at all. So I really think when people ask me, like, what can the workplace do to help caregivers, I always say grief, conversations and, education and compassion training. And then people always say, what does that look like? And I'm like, I actually don't know what that looks like, but I think just by having the conversations, cultures are going to be that much more improved if they think about, like, how can we be more compassionate and how can we be more understanding, at least start the work, they're going to be better off. So there's that aspect of grief. The whole prolonged grief syndrome, and I don't know. Like I said,
Like
so
the timeline on it is like, huh?
yeah, I mean, and you caught me. So tomorrow is my husband's death anniversary. So 3 years.
And what's his name?
Kevin.
Kevin.
So, so anniversaries are always like raw and emotional, and you're never really sure why, but like your body holds the memories, or who knows, whatever. And you're like, 3 years ago, here's where I was, and this is what was happening. And I think, one of the things that we talked about earlier in the working daughter community, that we learn that you can hold two things at the same time. My experience of grief is that it's all about learning how to be sad and happy at the same time. And so when I look at, I did, like I said, I did a lot of reading on what they're doing around prolonged grief syndrome. And I can appreciate both the pros and the cons, right? The pros being that insurance might cover some support that people need, that, there's an avenue to talk about it, to get support, help, et cetera, to recognize that grief exists.
Yes.
And the cons that, like, I don't think there's anything abnormal about it. And I think these normal timelines are absurd. Absolutely. I'm 3 years in, I kind of feel like I'm still a newbie. Like, I still, people are like, oh, next book's going to be about being a widow. I'm like, I'm just one widow with one widowed experience. I have nothing to say. I am learning, right? At least with Eldercare, I have like the whole community that I'm learning and pulling from, and multiple experiences. So I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm learning on the fly, but I can only imagine. I was with this guy for 29 years since I was 23, and I haven't just lost my past, I've lost my future, right? How will I ever not be sad?
Yeah.
But I still have great days and get up and choose to have a blast,
Yeah.
So to me, it's just back to, like, multiple things exist at the same time. So anyway, I'm rambling. I really don't understand grief at all.
Well, I think that's it, though. I think that is the profound element, that we don't do well when we are uncertain. And grief is like the big ambiguous uncertainty, and also so acute that you can feel it in your body so significantly that you're like, I don't know what it is, but I know how it feels. And I know how it can be super debilitating. And I also know what it feels like to try to skirt around it and to stay away from it. But also when it like washes over me, that I can't see straight. And so the fact that we create no space for it, like the 3 days thing, right? The 3 to 10 day thing is just like, well, we know that that's not it. and even more so the idea that a year, I think that I love exactly when I read that, I was like, okay, if it is the way that our systems can actually say, okay, we'll help you if we need that, then great. Then we have actually, that's not the solution, but it's a band-aid for the brokenness that we have in a certain spot right now. But the bigger issue, right, is this taboo shame that we're talking about across everything we don't talk about, that for some reason us to have a diagnostic dynamic of like a psychiatric condition is something to be ashamed of, where grief is a very universal experience that we have, and we experience it differently from day to day, from moment to moment. And so how important it is, again, I think, as you're talking about, like, kind of figuring it out as we move, showing up and being able to talk about it is such an important part of the process. And if we only say after a year, you can't, if you go so rigid and don't leave room for the fact that there are different experiences, that becomes problematic. The other thing, there's this, I'm going to have to put this in the show notes. There's a song that came on Spotify out of nowhere. I don't even, because I thought my sister had sent it to me, and I said it to her. She's like, I don't know what that song is. And I was like, okay. And I just get to this point where I believe there are all these little things that just get sprinkled, that I'm like, okay, I was supposed to see that at that moment in time. There's a song called Glitter, and I can't even remember the guy's name that sings it, that came into my sphere about 3 months ago. And I was driving, I can see the rotary I was going around, because, Massachusetts, it's all rotaries all the freaking time. And it hit me. And it was talking about how grief's just like glitter. That like initially there's this like glitter bomb that goes off. You're like, oh my God, it's everywhere. And you think you can like pull it all together and you think you can kind of get rid of it, but it's like on your eye, it's in your hair.
Piece that never comes off.
Yeah, right. And you vacuum it, you think you've got it, and then the sun will shine and there's a whole piece of glitter like 3 years later that you're like, oh God. And that song, I'm like getting chills right now. That song hits on so many different elements of the fact that grief is not one thing. It is all encompassing, and it also can be as small as a piece of glitter that just gets you. And there's no one right way to do it or feel about it, and you're not going to be over it.
Right.
And so the idea of like, okay, what is it to be debilitating you in your inability to like live life? And also, can we make space for the times where you're not going to be able to get out of bed because it is really hard? Again, both those things can exist at the same time.
Yeah, I rambled on and on about grief and what I don't know it is. What I do know for sure is that we need to make more space for it. We need to normalize it more. And I think, COVID, I think, has done that too, because not only was it, the massive number of life loss that we had during COVID, not to say that COVID is over, but, in the heyday, but also the loss of normalcy and life as we knew it. And I remember, when we all first went to shut down for 3 weeks around March 20th or whatever of 2020, that was just about the 1 year mark after my husband had died. And now I have friends telling me, as we're like several months into the shutdown or, life not being normal, they're like, oh my God, like I wake up every day and I'm like, oh my God, I just remembered what I'm living in. And I feel so disoriented and nothing is the same anymore. And I'm like, hold my Chardonnay, like, welcome to my world. Like, of course I had like serious compassion, lack of compassion at the time. But yes, friends, yes. Now you know what it is like to lose someone and be completely like, all of the things they talk about in the list of symptoms for the prolonged griefs, to be lonely and confused and wonder what the meaning of life is and all of these things. So I think, if we have to find we don't have to find silver linings, but there's always something we can take with us from any experience. And so I think one of them from COVID is that it's just kind of leveled the playing field and normalized a lot of things that we never expected to normalize.
And that we had to talk about for sure.
Yeah. That we have to talk about. Yeah.
I love, so in this was a while ago, an episode I did, her name is Janine Kuo, and she actually just came out with a book called Welcome to the Grief Club. She had just come up with the idea, or I can't remember, it was a while ago. And so it's great that she's birthed that baby into the world, because it was like a twinkle in the eye when we were talking about it last time. And we were talking about Harry Potter, which I don't really know Harry Potter very well. I don't know if you do. But one of the elements that she talked about was there's a character in Harry Potter where there's Harry, and I can't remember the woman's name. And I ended up watching the movies after. She's blonde in the movie.
I didn't watch the movies, but I like the books, so I can't help.
Okay. Well, maybe you'll know it from this. She had lost people in her life, and then Harry had lost his mentor, I think it was. And sorry for the spoiler alerts of anybody that's in the middle of Harry Potter right now. And there were these carriages that were flying, they were kind of horseless carriages that they had seen just in Hogwarts land. Again, for the Potterheads are like,
you're doing great. You're doing great.
And once you go through that kind of seismic experience of grief, you actually see the horses that are flying horses moving those carriages along.
I don't remember that.
Those horses before. And to me, it was like such a beautiful, I'm getting chills even right now. It's such a beautiful expression of the fact that grief is all around us, loss is all around us all the time. And sometimes it's just a matter of you having to experience it for your like lenses to be able to see the things that were there for a lot of people all along. And so there is, I think we've all gotten at least some version of our vision checked where our lenses can see a little bit more into things than we were able to see before, whether that be a loss of a person that's close to you or a loss of your autonomy or your freedom or whatever you want to. I'm like rolling my eyes because I'm feeling like there's a whole bunch of ways that whole language can go. But that we have lost our sense of how we operate in this world. And a lot of us have lost people close to us, whether that be through COVID or be through a lot of other elements. And we've had to still get up and we've had to still figure out how to operate in that space. And so
we lost what we can rely on, right? Yes. We don't, and just as you started to come through moments, then like an Omicron would come along. And now I think we know like anything can come along. And, I remember we all got through 2020 and we were like, yes, pop the champagne. And then there was January 6th.
Yeah.
Like that wasn't supposed to happen.
No.
And then, so this year when we started to get through it and then Omicron came for the holidays so then all of a sudden there's a war in Ukraine, like, yeah, okay. Yep. This is what happens. Like we cannot rely on anything. And for many of us, like, okay, it's good to understand and recognize our resilience. And, and for many of us, I mean, look at the mental health and the substance abuse, and it's hard. So,
yeah. Yeah. I honestly, so, okay. The last thing okay. So for people that are listening to this right now saying, hey, I'm a working daughter, I didn't know about this, or I know like 10 people that I need to tell about working daughter. How can they, one, get involved, and two, kind of, I know I wrote that we had in the initial part about National Working Daughters Day, like where is the working daughter community movement, how people can get involved, and kind of where you see things going, whether it be we know exactly where it's going to be, or we're just muddling through to the next place that you were talking about before.
Yeah. Well, we're not muddling through, but we're just like, there's so much to do, and just how quickly it rolls out. And sometimes it doesn't. And, like that's part of starting an organization in caregiving has just been like, I don't know if I was telling you this before, but Aussie Media did a feature on me last year, which was great, because it was raising awareness about working daughters. But I remember that the reporter came back. She's like, my editor thinks that you should have a much larger following than you do already. And I was like, well, tell your editor I took 3 breaks to care for people. But anyway, so Working Daughter Day, let's start there, is purposely in November, and because that's National Family Caregiver Month. So we figured it would be a good time to recognize working daughters during National Family Caregiver Month. And it's always the second Tuesday. So this year will be November 15th, second Tuesday, because the first Tuesday is an election every few years. And it's really a day of awareness that there are, in my estimate, about 20 million working daughters. And you started out talking about, there are a significant amount of working daughters. Well, when I wrote Mogul Mom and Maid, there were 23 million working mothers. And I assume the number is probably fairly similar. But why do we not know that there are working daughters when it's practically the same number? Out of the 54 million family caregivers, I'd say 20 are working daughters. So women who are balancing both. Yeah. So to raise awareness for the fact that there are as many working daughters as there are working mothers, this year, I think as members of the community, so those of us who are in it, will focus on advocacy, and there'll be some toolkits to help, write to legislators and raise awareness and do op-eds about the fact that we need all the supports for that, imaginary Washington symposium that you and I were talking about, because working daughters, I think, could be such a force if they weren't so exhausted. So we'll hand them the tools. And then for businesses, it's, a perfect opportunity to say, hey, I'm going to do an event and recognize that working daughters exist. So the first year, I think Cigna participated, and they did like care packages or something for their working daughters, which was really nice. Another company did like a lecture series. And so that's the point of Working Daughter, for both businesses to say, hey, I need to support this group of employees, and for working daughters to have the tools to do what they wish they could do if they weren't so damn tired, which is advocate for themselves. And then the way to get involved with working daughters. So I'll say the magic happens in the Facebook community. It's a private Facebook group, and everything's called Working Daughter, so it's easy to find. But that's where you find 6,000 friends who are going through what you're going through, and who understand when you say, I hate this and I love this, or what's the best adult diaper that doesn't leak, or whatever it is you might need to talk about that we don't talk about in mixed polite company. Yes. And then if you're looking for tools, then there's a Working Daughter membership site, and that's all under workingdaughter.com. So if you're looking to get monthly coaching calls and lists and checklists, here are the 10 legal documents I need, and there, then that exists too. So there are many ways to access Working Daughter, depending on what you need. I mean, it's a fluid situation, so people need different things at different times.
I love that, because honestly, as you're talking, I feel like oh, have you talked about this before? Like my brain was like, oh, she answered the question I had in my head before I asked it. Like, I love that there is that progression of, hey, if you want to dip a toe and support other people, maybe this isn't your experience or there's someone in your life that's going through this, but you're not really sure what to do. There are ways to get involved. You just want to be surrounded by people. Come on in. And if you want direct, like, I'll hold your hand for a little while support, or you don't even have to, here's the template. It's kind of like when you're talking about early on about the woman that was like, how much should I be bringing in for alcohol? There's like all these checklists for how to plan your wedding. You're like, here's how to think about your legal experience. Here's how to talk about end of life dynamics. Here's how to do all of these things. You don't have to go to WebMD version of the internet and think that that's the way. Like, here's a lot of people that have been through it and can actually support you. And I love, I feel like, especially right now, or if you are a person at that moment in that, like, trying to figure this stuff out, that ability to kind of shut off your emotional brain to get into productive brain is like, it's impossible to think we can just do that. And so allowing the space for people to come in and hold you up and be that, what I talked about a lot of times on the podcast, sistering support, that additional, just like, I'll stand here, lean on me, I've got you, is so important in these moments.
Yeah. Yeah. We even have a store, and it's curated that you can find through Working Daughter. It's, one of the top menu tabs, but it's curated Amazon. So anytime anybody in the community says, has anyone used a walker that glides really well over, the rug or whatever, we throw it in we curate it on Amazon. And so I always say, if the product isn't in there, it's because no one has recommended it yet. And so it's not everything you'll ever find for working care, but it's, what there was the spaces that existed for moms for so long that didn't exist for working daughters because we didn't have a label. Yeah. And once we labeled it, then we could start to pull, like you said, that sort of sisterhood of knowledge and experience. So you didn't have to figure it out yourself every single time.
And just like, and again, I'm going to have to find this recording. When I was talking about the disability advocate earlier, one of the things that she was talking about was that, like, at any moment you could become part of this community. At any moment you could become part of the disabled community, or people with disabilities. Let me clarify, because we do use people first language. In the same way, at any moment you can become part of this community, whether you are now or you will potentially be some way someday. And so this is such an important thing to create space around it, to be able to talk about. And I'm so grateful for you coming here today, because I think a lot of what we've talked about is that you're talking about, like, in polite company, like, this is the podcast. I love being in the non-polite company. And so for anybody, and for those of you listening, we'll have all of these links on the show notes page. We will definitely make sure that you have information to connect with Liz if you'd like. And I am just, again, we could talk about this for hours. I love that. So I'm just so grateful for you coming here. And yeah, I'm excited for you being that, that 70s pioneer here for this. I'm here for it. Yeah. And I will be in Washington with you. I will be in
the back, right? What do they call them? The pussy bows or something?
The big, like, is the feathered hair back too? I mean, I could, yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for doing the work and exploring this. I love it. Appreciate it.
So many amazing resources provided by Liz today. I hope for any of you that have been feeling alone in this journey of elder care and trying to navigate your career or your life while also operating with all of these different dynamics that are coming up emotionally, mentally, physically, as you're just trying to create a stability in a world that feels like it's not stable right now. If you're trying to grapple with the changing in dynamics with the elders in your life, you're really, really not alone. And I encourage you, if this episode resonated with you, don't hesitate to reach out to Liz. If you are a working daughter, join the Working Daughter community. You do not have to go this alone. You do not have to be the strong, silent one. We need each other right now more than ever. And so if you are at the end of this feeling like, yes, I need support, this is an additional invitation to reach out to Liz. She has so many great resources for you. And on the Working Daughter site, there's, as she mentioned, so many amazing resources. If there's something else that you want to make sure you check out, we have a show notes page. So if you go to nikkyinnocent.com/podcast, you will see Liz's face on there. Click on there. You'll get the show notes page that has all the deep dive on some of the articles we talked about, some of the books we talked about, that song I talked about, Glitter. Yeah. I welcome you. Let me know if you can listen to it without crying. I couldn't. So I hope you enjoy all of those resources, and I can't wait to catch you on the next episode.